Hey guys, welcome back. We're on lesson 2 of unit 1. And for this lesson, we're going to be looking at key features of linear and exponential functions. So your learning target for today will be that I can identify the key features of linear and exponential functions. All right, so let's go ahead and first review these key features, our x-intercept and our y-intercept. And our x-intercept is basically where the graph, let's call it the point xy, where the graph intersects the x-axis. Now, whenever we have an x-intercept, your x value will be your x value, and the y value will always be 0. Now, let's look at the y-intercept. Y-intercept is very similar, except now it's where the graph intersects the y-axis. So it is the point where the graph intersects the y-axis. Now for this one, your x will always be 0 and your y will be that y-intercept. All right, let's go ahead and use those two. Go ahead and start with this linear function. Now let's highlight our x-axis to find our x-intercept. Now notice how our graph, this one is our graph. That's my linear function. And the point that they intersect is at this point here. So this would be my x-intercept. Now the location of that x-intercept will be where it intersects for my x, and my y value is always going to be 0. Now let's look at the y-intercept. Now I'm going to highlight this y-intercept in green. Now we're looking where the function intersects that y-axis and it intersects here. So this is going to be my y-intercept. And the location of that y-intercept, remember your x will always be 0 and your y-intercept is at positive 4. So the next key feature that we'll be looking at is the asymptote. Asymptote is that horizontal line that the graph approaches but never touches. Now, we looked at horizontal lines. We'll be looking at some vertical lines later on in the year, but for now, we'll stick with the horizontal. So let's look at, we find our asymptotes in exponential functions. Now, first, let's go ahead and look at our x and y intercepts as a review from the previous one. Now our exponential function is this red line right here. Then I will be highlighting. Notice how it gets really flat down here. Our y-intercept, we'll look at where that graph intersects this axis, and it intersects at this point. So this will be my y-intercept. Now the location of that y-intercept, remember your x is always 0, and then your y value is 2. Let's look at the x-intercept. Notice how that graph is not touching the x-axis, therefore there are no x-intercepts. And now let's look at our asymptote. So one thing I forgot to mention is that your asymptote is an imaginary line. So let's go ahead and add imaginary. So it's an imaginary horizontal line that the graph approaches but never touches. So let's go over here and let's go ahead and draw, let's just draw it down here, this imaginary line. Notice how the graph is not touching it, but my graph, the yellow one, is not approaching it either. There's this huge gap between them. So that's not where my asymptote is. If I draw it, let's say I draw it up here. Okay, well, that graph is intersecting, I'm sorry, that invisible horizontal line is intersecting the graph, so that can't be our asymptote either. But if I were to draw a line, let's say here, this red line or the actual graph is getting super close to that imaginary line, but it'll never touch it. It's approaching it, but it never touches it. So in this case, this will be my asymptote. Now the equation for the asymptote, because it is a horizontal line, will begin with y equals. If it's horizontal, the equation starts with y equals. And then because all these points on this imaginary line will have a y value of 1, then the equation for my asymptote is y is equal to 1. All right, good luck on your assignment.